Hello and welcome to the March 13th edition of the SIG Cluster Lifecycle weekly meeting. Looks like Tim has most of the agenda today, so I'll hand it over and let you start going through those items.
So the first one is the PSA that there's been a rollback on etcd because of the scale testing uncovered some performance degradation. The long story around this is etcd 3.2 had a series of fixes that are very important to prevent a couple of catastrophic failures, and some people had seen them in the field. But with this modification for 3.2, there was some late breaking test results that came in from the perf team from Poland, and those results showed a degradation, a pretty large degradation in high scale performance for large clusters. So the work plan is to, they backported some of the fixes into the etcd 3.1 series, and that is what etcd 3.1.12 is. So previous rendition of kubelet deployed etcd 3.1.10, and this should contain the server-side fixes that exist for the two issues inside of this in the 3.1.12 release. Hopefully that one makes sense.
So as a clarifying point, if you run kubeadmin upgrade from 1.9 to 1.10, we will upgrade etcd for you from 3.1.10 to 3.1.12 is what it sounds like.
Yes, and I don't recall, I have to dig this up because it's not off the top of my head, recall what the story is about the upgrade process for different scenarios, because I know we willfully punted on etcd upgrade, so I need to validate that bit.
Okay, so a new kubeadmin cluster at 1.10 will give you 3.1.12 etcd, but we don't know if an upgrade will actually move you forward, or we think that it will because it's just a patch release and we don't have to do any data conversions.
The way we've been structuring upgrades is we've always been doing it as a feed forward mechanism. So it should work. And I know the code that was written a while ago did this roll check, save the data, update, roll back a failure. So I have to verify whether or not the standard upgrade scenario works right, because there was a couple different upgrade paths that we had supported. So I need to verify that it does do an upgrade to 3.1.12. This kind of leads into the next topic, which is the upgrade tests have never worked inside of the test infra. And the reason they have never worked, and I don't know that all of the history here because this issue is really conflating. There's a bunch of machinations that go on as part of the upgrade tests that don't exist in the other tests. So some of the other tests are very straightforward. They install kubelet from a given target release with known artifacts, and then away they go. But the upgrade test takes artifacts from a cross-build location, which is built by a different separate test. So it's very confusing. I don't understand the reason why it's done this way. I'm sure Lucas had reasons because he usually did everything for a reason. But I don't understand the logic there. And I was working with the test infra folks to try and understand why we're doing this. And so if anyone has insight into understanding
I think it's because the build artifacts are used across different tests.
Well, yeah, it is, but I don't know why. Like the question that I've I really don't understand in the long haul is, I know we want to get to Bazel, and Bazel will build all the artifacts as part of a single build, and then all of those artifacts will be part of your testing run. And I really want to get there, and I even want to force it if we can, because this split sort of handoff that we have going on is totally broken, and no one was paying attention to it. So like it's been broken since 1.9 alpha. And we didn't get signal until someone poked it at the end of the 1.10 release, which basically says people aren't paying attention.
Test grid has it's possible to send emails for broken jobs So somebody has to probably configure that.
Sure, but the problem is like test grid's noisy too, right? So there's has to be like this fine line between what is useful signal and what is useful signal that people will pay attention to, and what is just noise. And the problem is a lot of people, myself included, because we have so much email from the Kubernetes project, err on the side of like filter and bucket all the things and make sure that only those that are super important get through the gauntlet that is the Gmail filters. So that's one of the things where we have too many tests in test grid. I cannot rationalize in my head why we have so many. But that's the state of that. I mean, does anyone have any insight into, I think the most important thing to get all the artifacts building out of the master, whatever branch they have on, is to have Bazel being able to do cross builds. And I know that was the one limitation that we've had for a long time. Does anyone have any insight into the state of that one?
No, I think we'd have to talk to the test infra folks, because I think, like folks like Jeff Grafton have been working on trying to switch us over to Bazel for a while.
Because that's the only limitation, and that also is part of the problem with our release process too, right? Because not all the artifacts, we have split division of artifacts. That's part of the reasons why the jobs are so complicated. That also leads into like my next topic is the jobs are super complicated. I didn't actually write this one down. The jobs are super complicated. When is Cluster API able to come so we can get rid of Kubernetes Anywhere? Because debugging the output from Kubernetes Anywhere is actually really difficult, because it kind of it has a level of obfuscation around kubeadm and init where we don't actually see some of the details.
So the short answer to that is we want to stabilize the API a little bit before we start rebasing tests on top of it, because otherwise making changes is going to break test grid, and we don't want to break test grid as we tweak the API. The goal was to have that by the end of Q1, which is the end of this month. Talking to Rodrigo, I think we're a little bit behind on that goal, and so it's likely to happen sometime middle of next release cycle.
If it's possible, we will throw resources on helping get rid of Kubernetes Anywhere to get Cluster API in place, because we're also interested in Cluster API. So we'd happily do that so that it's much more maintainable. Because right now, no one maintains Kubernetes Anywhere, really. It's kind of this ill-maintained thing, and when issues happen, we have to poke the people who have the most knowledge about how it was set up, and it's really difficult to understand. So I think next cycle, I'd happily throw folks under the bus to get Cluster API as part of the blocking jobs for kubeadm installations.
Yeah, I think that would be great. And I think, like I said, I think we're getting closer. We've been doing a lot of refactoring, trying to move away from CRDs to API aggregation, which caused a lot of churn in the code. Like I just LGTM'd a PR yesterday that deleted 8 million lines of code because there was lots of vendor dependencies. So again, like I don't want to be doing that sort of thing and break all of the kubeadmin tests that are blocking tests as we are churning something that we're calling alpha.
Yeah, I think once you reach a stable-ish point, doing lockstep integration makes a lot of sense. So like you can churn independently at your own will and then lockstep integrate as a vendor and vendor it in.
Yeah, and that being said, people are actively working on the Cluster API, unlike Kubernetes Anywhere. So even biting the bullet sooner, if we end up breaking things, at least people are working on it and are incentivized to fix them, as opposed to Kubernetes Anywhere, where it's only when somebody kind of twists your arm a little bit, you're like, oh, I guess I'll go fix that because I really want to be working on something different.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the problem I've faced is that no one understands the details. So we're all kind of like playing a game of Clue. And we have enough breadcrumbs sometimes to be able to diagnose the problem, but there's no one that actually owns it. And I feel like once we I want to have concrete ownership of some of the testing infrastructure, so that way, like if things fail, we can loop in the right folks at a whim to help fix it.
Tim, hi. Quick
Yep.
question here. I remember you were talking once about a single node kubeADM thing.
Yes.
Would that be helpful, or do we still need, how many of the tests would be single node versus the multi-node kubeADM?
You can do multi-node on a single node, and that's part of, there's a separate effort that's ongoing in the testing commons, which is a sub-project of SIG testing, where we have a spec that we're trying to create that's basically how do we create this client interface library for folks to import that provides a consistent means to basically spin up a 1 to n node DIND cluster behind the scenes, so that way they can do all their ETE testing locally, right? That's useful for a lot of people who want to do both integration and end-to-end testing in a sandbox single node environment that looks like a multi-node. And people do this today already, but it's duct tape and Bondo and Mr. Wizard tricks. And we want to create a single client interface library that gives a programmatic interface for people to write tests against. So that's a work in progress.
Okay, thank you.
But we have a lot of inertia, and folks are working on it, and we're going to have a spec. So if people want to help out, there is a Slack channel called Testing Commons, and the top of that Slack channel is basically the spec that we're trying to rally folks on. And ideally, DIMS, I would love to replace local cluster up with something like that. That's my long-term goal.
Got it.
And that 1 to n node DIND cluster is using kubeadmin?
Yes, yes.
And for people who don't know, DIND is Docker in Docker.
Yep.
So that you can run it all on a single host.
Yeah, there's a broad swath of folks. This would do two things for cluster lifecycle too. It provide the entire community with a means of spinning up local clusters through a programmatic way for them to write their tests. So if people are writing components that are external, like the cluster API, they could write integration tests without them having to, it would be a local spin. And this would also work for other things like, I have a greedy self-interest of having Sonabuoy on every single PR request to be able to not have to blast out to cloud providers for every single thing, and to have spin up a 1 to n node cluster for every PR that can then run the tests against it. Any questions come?
I was curious how that overlaps with Minikube. So Minikube is also sort of a local Kubernetes development environment that was not created by SIG Cluster Lifecycle, but sort of maybe nominally falls under SIG Cluster Lifecycle in the same way because it's used to create sort of local clusters.
The one big difference there is Minikube is a turducken. So it's like it starts up a VM that does Docker inside of it and then does all the other stuff. That's one thing. But the other thing is that we want to build against any arbitrary artifacts that are built. So we want to be able to specify, it could basically run against head of master and build those components and test those components locally. And you can't do that with Minikube.
Tim, Minikube has a version which does not need a VM now. They added it about 6 months ago, I think.
That'd be interesting. Do you know if it does the N node though configuration?
I don't think so. It's still Minikube, right? So it's probably still one node.
Yeah. So I could talk with those folks. I'd happy to kind of loop them into the conversation, because I think if we can ideally get to a place where all these things converge, I don't want to own or maintain any of it. I just want the interface to be able to write my tests against that, is consistent.
Yeah, that's why I brought up Minikube. Because there are a set of folks there that are trying to solve a similar use case, which is, I want to run something locally to play with Kubernetes or to test my Kubernetes code. And it would be nice if we could get those people at least involved in the discussions of the testing common stuff, because they might be interested in helping shape that project and adopting it as well.
Yep. Yeah, I will try to talk with them too. I will put that on the agenda for our next meeting. Okay. But the side goal there too is we don't just want to have straight up DIN nodes all the time, is that we want to be able to provide the capabilities to spin up pieces of the control plane for doing performance level testing. So people could, you want to be able to have a programmatic interface to say, I have these components and here's your kubelet config for pieces of it, and then go. So ideally we need component config for some of this stuff, because we would want to be able to, turn down some things and turn up other things with different knobs. So that way, if a person wanted to do like scheduler testing against hollow nodes, I don't want to spin up, 1,000 DIN nodes on a single machine, but I do want to spin up 1,000 hollow nodes and then do a performance level integration test against that, partial integration test.
Yeah, Alexander pointed out in chat that Minikube is maybe more targeted towards app developers, where it sounds like what you're working on is really targeted at Kubernetes developers that are trying to configure Kubernetes clusters in different ways for performance testing or for individual component testing in more of an ED environment. And so maybe there's not a lot of overlap there, but I think it's definitely worth talking and trying to see if maybe we can use some of the same facilities under the hood to get those two projects going.
I absolutely think that there are pieces that will definitely overlap, but its primary focus is not just Kubernetes developers, but anyone who is developing integrations for Kubernetes. So.
Cool, thanks, Tim. That was a very useful side tangent you took us on there.
Should we go on to the next topic?
Yes.
The next topic is the HA upgrade doc. So Jamie in 1.9 created the original, like how to do HA with Kubernetes the hard way, or with kubelet the hard way. But we didn't actually publish a doc that outlines how do you upgrade that. So I know Martin had created the doc and he's been giving feedback. So if folks could do one last pass on that doc, hopefully this will be the last round, and we'll get out the details there. That would be helpful. And there's other ongoing work, which is part of the other breakout session where we're helping to define the next state. And there's a lot of actually ongoing work. There's proposals for master join scenarios. There are also other external documentation that people are working on for SIG Lifecycle. And there's other work with regards to how do you store individual node state for the control plane hosts. I'm trying not to say master nodes in an HA environment, because currently right now there's an issue which exists in the upgrade doc that Matt is aware of and talked about in a separate issue regarding management of that config map when you're doing the upgrade process. So folks can comment and look over that. That would be helpful. And we'll give it one last review and then try to get it merged before the release.
Speaking of getting things merged before the release, it looks like your next item is code freezes on Wednesday. For the documentation PR in particular, does that probably has a little bit more slack before it has to go in?
Probably. I don't actually know the dates for that. We'd probably have to talk with the SIG release team, but usually they're pretty asynchronous, and they can merge things on non-release boundaries. So I think that seems reasonable. I would like to have the doc in place, because part of what people will do is they'll try to upgrade And we want to make sure that that user story is not explosive.
Yeah, and in particular, it would be nice as we're cutting like beta releases or release candidates if people have instructions on how to do upgrades so they could test the upgrade scenario from 1.9 to 1.10. Would be nice.
That's the HA upgrade scenario. Yeah. There was another person, I forgot who it was, if they're on the call right now, that was also looking at updating the documentation for the massive plethora of configuration options that have been added, because there isn't actually a good document for that. And I do think that part of the GA release cycle, we should update and have a well-defined set of config knobs that are documented for folks to use. You can generate and take a look at the one that's created as part of the config map that gets stored on your cluster, but there's not a document to reference that basically says, here are all the knobs, and this is where all the things that it does. So what I'm planning on doing within the next week or so, I might be out next week because we have an onsite in Seattle. So if you want to have coffee or whatever, feel free to hit me up. And the plan is my current tentative plan is to try to triage the GA list and the 111 list to be an actual actionable set of items that we should go through as a SIG too, and get people to sign up for, because I know people are interested in certain pieces, and be able to have a little bit more rigor with our execution process, so that way we can get the train flowing. This cycle was the first one without Lucas, so it was a lot of bumps and starts and things. And I'd like to smooth it out for next cycle, so that way folks who want to contribute have well-defined execution path. Because there have been a lot of new folks who have been spun up this cycle who are interested in contributing, which is good. That was part of the effort.
Yeah, that sounds great. It sounds like we're making pretty good progress on trying to get more people involved.
Yeah, and I'll be more actively involved too, and try to clean up things as they go to try and get it in a state that anyone can make sense out of. Because right now it's difficult to divine from 2 repos, 5 tests, and docs, what the current state of everything is. And I want to disambiguate that stuff so it's just clear as day.
In terms of what's your plan for disambiguating, I know that we're starting to have a number of, Matt linked in chat, a KEP related to kubeadmin config for HA. There's also a KEP for kubeadmin join. Does it make sense to make like a top level KEP for kubeadmin and use that to sort of be the entry point for sort of current status? There's a section in KEPs for implementation history. We can link to the sub KEPs for specific pieces.
I like that idea. The KEP process, I mean, one thing I've been finding about the KEP process is it forces people to have a common vernacular on how we communicate and execution plan. And it's actually really helpful in this distributed type of environment. So I would be totally game for that, because I think that would help to have a single point of entry, which isn't an ill-maintained wiki page, but something that we actually have to maintain as developers as we go along, because we will enforce some level of process, and that'll give us a means by which to check every iteration what we're actually doing.
Right. That's kind of why I was wondering if you had a different plan, or if maybe that was a reasonable plan to go forward, because it seems like we're, as a community, starting to move in the direction of using KEPs, and our SIG is starting to send out more PRs for KEPs, and maybe that's a good place to sort of coordinate as like the coordination point for
I think there's
status.
I think there's 2 parts. That's one part. I think the second part is making sure we actually have clarity of the issues in the kubeadm repo with relative prioritization and the breakdown of some of the items. That has always been an ongoing problem because of the split in repositories. People get very confused and they file issues still on Kubernetes, especially newcomers. So what I want to do is to try and distill down. I did it in the beginning of the 110 cycle. I went through the entire Lucas's backlog, as well as all of the issues that were on the main KK repo, and I want to make sure that we have things broken down there as much as we can, as well as possibly have like a template modification for components. So that way, if a person files an issue, it gets labeled, because one of the problems I find is that the labeling from the main upline or from the main upstream is not consistent. So if I'm going to do a review or find the issues associated, or the PR issues and PRs associated with a given release, it's really difficult to find because it's not consistent. So if people can add like an area or a component label as part of their issue, that would just help a ton. Because right now I have a series of queries for GitHub, and GitHub is terrible for queries, to try and make sense out of it.
I mean, we can certainly make like the new issue template for the kubeadmin repo, have some descriptive text to try and encourage people to set those labels. I don't know if we can set labels by default on new issues or not. That would be kind of an interesting thing to do.
I'm more interested in some set of defaults that people can uncomment on the mainline repo, so that when PRs come in particular, you can triage them appropriately. But there are issues that come inbound for kubeadm in the mainline repo. There's quite a few of them, actually.
Do you know if anybody from Contribex is working on auto labeling of PRs? Right, I know that there's been some effort to auto label issues and assign SIG labels to issues and sort of keep issues associated with SIGs. And there's some work to auto assign PRs to reviewers and owners. But it sounds like maybe what you're asking for is, based on the contents of a PR, can we auto assign like the area labels in the same way that we owners like assign it to a SIG or something?
Some of that is done, but I think having the person be explicit about it up front, it actually helps a lot, especially if you want to loop in PR reviewers, right? Because what happens is, even if it has the SIG label, the people who are the reviewers of that content area aren't necessarily notified of when something has arrived. And I do have my filters set up to allow this particular area of PR reviews to come through the gauntlet of GitHub filters. And I regularly try to take a look at that, at least once a week, just burn through it all. Right? So I think if people who are new to the community want a issue looped in, I have a half filled in comment where please CC at SIG cluster lifecycle PR reviews on any PRs that you make to the upstream repo, and that will help loop in the right folks. And I do know that there are a couple of folks in China who are very are quick to review, and they're great. And usually what I like to do is, if I don't get to a review in time and somebody else has already started, I just verify sanity and give it the approval marker once other folks are happy with it too.
All right, the last agenda item that you're filling in right now is code freeze is Wednesday. So from what I understand, I've been following along very closely with this release, but based on last releases, I think it'll cut the branch on Wednesday and try not to let anything else in, right?
Yeah, so everything that's in the 110 milestone is on the kubeadm repo. I'm just going to punt out right now, like probably today. So unless there are things that are added, the SIG, I'm going to punt that. I'm going to triage the tracking issue that we have on the main repository. The only one that I think requires attention, the only issue that I can think of that requires attention is setting the defaults for the release. I do know that there was usually like one, I think Lucas fixed this, but I need to verify it, that he uses the latest, he uses the tags from a stashed location on GCS buckets to determine what is the latest. And then he sets the min supported version. But I need to verify that this is all correct still, and that a build against that I can actually get the beta versions in there as part of the latest build stuff. And then I can get the actual release tag for 110, and I don't need to update some const or some variable inside of the code. Because I know that wasn't the case a while ago. So I want to verify that last bit.
I think by default it should be pointing to stable one.
Yeah, it uses the GCS buckets, but one thing we found out about last night is that they're not consistent either. There was an issue that CI cross build job was that kubelet depended upon if you said CI slash
it will go to CI cross bucket.
Yes, exactly, and that cross bucket was not maintained. So that job was not actually updating the artifacts in that location.
Okay. Well, I didn't like this piece of code before, but no. It was a long story between me and Lucas discussing this disambiguity, what like in command line the label is meant CI slash something and the actual content is under CI cross bucket.
Yeah, and the problem that I mentioned earlier in the call, the test grid issue, the 1.9 to 1.10 upgrade, is that particular job is the only job that uses that location of the CI cross bucket, which the artifacts are not being published or updated. So I need to talk with test infra today about figuring out what happened to that job. And I know there's complexity and other issues associated, so I need to figure out what makes sense there. If you have any insight, Alexander, I'd love to hear it. Maybe after this call, because it's pretty confusing as heck to me.
Okay, well, yes, we can talk about that. And actually, if a CI bucket populated from some builds, we can just change this piece of code which does this ugly bug between CI cross mapping.
Other test grid stuff all looks green. So regular 1.10 release stuff, all the issues have been fixed that I'm aware of. We haven't had any blockers. So the straight up 1.10 release looks clean. If folks want to validate or do some type of upgrade testing manually, that would probably be beneficial from the community perspective until we can figure out what's wrong with this test infra problem. You unmuted, Dims.
Yeah, I wanted to just ask you, last two releases, I remember Lucas had like one PR that merged just before we shipped. Do we have one of those this time?
That's my thing I was just talking about a second ago, was the defaults.
Thank you.
That PR is the one I need to hunt down this cycle to try and understand. If you have a link to his old PRs, that would help too, to understand what is the final step in the puzzle to make sure that the defaults are all seen for the release.
Yeah, I can find it.
Awesome. Thanks, Tims. That's all the topics I have. I know there was long-term questions, which I think we'll probably have to punt to until 1.11. There's the kubelet dynamic configuration that got punted out, which I really wanted to have in, but we're gonna have to punt that out. What was the other one? CoreDNS, questionable by default. Ideally, I'd like to get those things in the 1.11 cycle. So when we have like a 1.11 planning, we should probably identify all of the core pieces that we want to get in place. I don't know if any other people have seen it, but we have definitely seen it. with the weird kubeDNS flakes have occurred periodically, and it varies from environment to environment on some deployments, but it's a common thing that folks have seen where DNS goes away and then it comes back, right? And then you're like, what? And it's all the kubeDNS. So I have struggled to recreate the environment, but we've gotten enough signal from the field, from other folks seeing it, that it's a thing. We just don't have enough data to identify when and where and how and why so far, how this happens. But hopefully with the CoreDNS and having a pseudo HA-ish type of deployment for CoreDNS would potentially solve or help solve this problem.
Is the kubeDNS deployment not replicated?
No.
It's a single pod?
Single pod. That's the default current configuration. There was a goal to replicate it and use anti-affinity, but that PR somehow, there was a problem with speed of that, and that PR got reverted. So that's part of the things we need to probably talk about.
Okay, because I know on GKE, I haven't heard of a lot of trouble with kubeDNS, but we scale the number of replicas with the size of the cluster. Right, so as your cluster bigger, you get more replicas, and there's actually an add-on we run that auto scales it as your cluster grows. And
yeah, I think that's part of the problem.
Yeah, scaling factor is based on both number of nodes and number of cores, right? So if you have lots of small nodes, it'll go up. If you have a smaller number of big nodes, it'll also go up, because we assume that basically the number of cores in your cluster will determine is a rough ratio to amount of DNS queries.
If you have a root issue that folks can reference, because this has come up on kubeADM deploys a number of times in a number of different conversations, I don't know if there's a root Kubernetes issue that we could track.
Well, I think that from what I can tell from SIG network, the plan is to switch to CoreDNS. So
yes, yeah.
I'm a little surprised that the kubeadmin deployment of kubeDNS would not be replicated, but CoreDNS would be replicated, because it seems like more reliability replicating the existing deployment would also give you.
They were doing it for both. Like the modifications in this cycle, I've only tracked some of them, and they were being done for both. So I have to dig in, and I want to have the conversation of like, let's eliminate this class of problems entirely for the future as we go to GA. So that way we don't kind of run into weird deployment issues in the field where people have like different sized clusters with different environments and things go down in very obtuse ways. Because when DNS goes down, it's a weird type of failure condition that people have a very difficult time making sense out of.
Yeah, we've seen that too. As I said before we started auto scaling the number of replicas, people definitely complained when DNS goes out. It's hard to debug because oftentimes it goes out under load, but then comes back. So. And I talked to Mike Toffin about dynamic config a couple weeks ago. I will sync back up with him again shortly and try to figure out where we are on that. Last I talked to him, he thought that part of it was going to make it for 110, but not the whole thing. But I'm not sure how much ended up making it in before the freeze. But it wasn't enough for us to use it, I don't think.
The 110 beta blog post mentioned kubelet dynamic config. So maybe it just mentions like, the partial functionality that is happening.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can tell you, when we talked, he said that there were basically two parts of dynamic config. The first part is moving the kubelet config API group from alpha to beta so that we have a stable API. And the second part is actually taking advantage of that in code in the kubelet to actually load config dynamically. And so he expected the first half of that to make it, but I don't know if it did. And it's a part of that, basically be able to have the kubelet load a config file from the local disk, but not load it dynamically. And I think what we were maybe misinterpreting was that dynamic config was on track to make it the whole bundle, where I think he was always thinking that the first half would land, but the second half wouldn't land. And it's less useful to us if it's just the first half.
Yes, we need the whole kit and caboodle in order for us to enable by default, and I would like to enable it by default because there are issues with unit file updates, right? And we ideally, if that information is stored on the cluster and upgraded as part of component upgrade, that would alleviate this problem entirely, because the packages that we create are not the best and well versioned and maintained. Hopefully, as we push those artifacts into Bazel, we can simplify them and get out of the business of having to maintain mucked up unit files, right? That we've had a number of issues where command line parameters and options have changed and they haven't percolated as part of the release. And as a process of upgrading some of these things have failed. But if the state of the kubelet configuration is stored on cluster, this greatly simplifies the problem and gets upgraded as part of the version semantics. So. All I have to say is fail on swap equals false.
Yeah, and it's just been a couple of releases now where we kept expecting it to sort of the whole thing to be there, and it hasn't gotten there. So it sounds like it is making progress, but it was maybe more work to get done than we'd been anticipating. All right, we're sort of at the end of the agenda. Does anyone else? We have 15 minutes of Slack time here, which I'm happy to give back to people and let people go early. But as long as we're all here, does anyone else have anything they'd like to add into the agenda for today? Dim's mentioned in chat that he had 2 PRs that he dropped into Slack, but he had to leave. So we don't need to discuss those right now. But if you are reviewing PRs, please go take a look.
I could quickly mention, I gave an update to SIG docs on the deletion of some really stale docs, getting started guides directory. And there's been a bit of movement there, and it's looking okay. As a result of this effort in this release cycle, I managed to delete like 3 guides straight away. And there are a few more bits of content that are sort of questionable, and I'm waiting for people to respond on that, on the issues in website repo. I've not checked back yet, but yeah, some progress there.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll mention we also, I think, have cleaned up a couple of the getting started guides related to KubeUp. Mike Denise and I have spent some time over the last couple of months ripping out a whole bunch of the KubeUp code that was no longer being used. I think we're down to basically only 2 places where it works now, which is GCE and what was it? CentOS, I think, is the other one, because there are a couple of folks that are still using the CentOS version of KubeUp. And even in the GCE one, we've been trying to rip out variants of it that are unsupported, like container VM support and container Linux support that we're not testing and we don't think anybody's using. So we are trying to sort of slim down that code surface and delete the associated getting started guides with that as well. So hopefully that's helping clean things up a little bit too. Again, as Tim alluded to earlier, we're sort of paving the way to eventually be able to switch to the cluster API and delete all the KubeUp code. I know it's been on Brian Grant's hit list for a while to delete the whole cluster directory. And deleting the KubeUp code is part of that, but there's also things like default add-on configs in there that I think a lot of people look at for references, and we'll have to find a new home for those.
I would love to have like a home for add-ons. That's a canonical location that could, we could house that home in the new org structure that's been created.
Yeah, I mean, like kubeadmin code, sort of like inline stuff, and I don't know. Could there be like a Go library that would implement add-ons, or I don't know? Let's talk about the guys.
Yeah, that's the whole add-ons V2 conversations that's happened for a long time. But I think as we trek towards GA, I think that should be on a hit list target for potential items. I think now that I have my bearings, at least, I'm going to plan to spin in folks and try and get execution on a lot of this stuff. So we actually have resources now to execute on a bunch of this. So
Yeah, and likewise at Google, add-ons is sort of bubbling up the list of things that we're going to start to care about more. We thought we'd found an owner to drive it from our end, but that didn't turn out to work out. So we're now looking for another person from our end to help drive that conversation too. So I think that in the next release cycle or two, we're going to actually start putting some weight behind moving forward with a better add-on story. So that's the hope. We'll see if it comes to fruition. All right, thanks, Elia, for the update. That's great. Great to see progress on cleaning up our documentation. I think that documentation is often something that we overlook, and we should probably be spending more time on it than we do. All right, with that, I think we'll give people the last 10 minutes back. Call us one a little bit early. Hopefully we'll see folks tomorrow morning at one of the breakout sessions.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Have a good week.